It's an interesting time for me to be here. You have this innovation conference going on about the NHS at a time when there's a massive pending discontinuity in the U.S. healthcare system. I think any of you who read the U.S. news are probably quite aware that President Obama has as his single greatest initiative is to really overhaul the U.S. healthcare system. And I would say that when he's done, it'll look a lot more like the NHS. So what I'd like to do today is share with you some of our views of how technology is going to need to change to really accommodate what we think is going to be a massive discontinuity in the healthcare system in the U.S. and how we plan as a medical technology company to actually introduce technology that not only will improve healthcare but will actually take cost out of the system. So this morning, in a short period of time, I'm going to share with you some of the themes of the decade that we use to really drive our strategic decisions within the company and how we go about deciding what we should and shouldn't be doing in technology. And again, what we do in the U.S. will play out here in England as well, because your issues are frankly global issues and we share them with you. I thought it would be helpful to give you just a 1-minute context for what Medtronic is. For those of you who don't know, this is a U.S.-based company like the National Health Service, founded 60 years ago. This company was founded on the basis of pacemaking technology. Modern cardiac surgery, as we know it, began at the University of Minnesota with the development of a heart-lung machine that could allow you to circulate blood. And as surgeons began to operate in the heart, they actually induced complete heart block. And so we began to make temporary pacemakers to deal with that issue. And from this relatively humble beginning in a garage, the company now has over 40,000 people working in some level in 120 countries. I've listed here on the left side of this slide simply the companies where we have major headquarters or major manufacturing facilities. But again, we operate in over 120 countries. And it's with this context that I would like to be talking to you about medical devices and how we see the future of devices changing. And necessarily this will have significant impact on the cost of care. Again, for those of you who don't know Medtronic, there's a standout here and you could go and look at some of our devices. But for the most part, we're an implant company. We make devices you can see on this slide that for pacing, for cardiac defibrillation. We make grafts that are placed endovascularly. We make cardiac valves. We have a very broad base of products for degenerative spine disease. You can see up here in the upper left hand one of the most interesting businesses we've had, which is to take our pacing technology and transform that into a business that we call neuromodulation. This is basically using pacing technology to stimulate the central and peripheral nervous system, and we can do this to treat a variety of diseases from movement disorders to chronic pain syndromes to overactive bladders, fecal incontinence. All of these things can be stimulated, and this is a business that we call neuromodulation. In sum total, these are basically implants, and we're treating chronic degenerative diseases. And I'm going to come back and talk about it because the burden of healthcare really has been borne by us attempting to palliate and lessen the symptoms of chronic disease. And as we go forward in the next decade, sort of dealing with chronic disease and whether these are the right ways to do it are issues that I think we can talk about today. Interestingly, this company now treats over 6 million people a year. So again, I'd like to sort of bring this context to you today and have you recognize that sort of decisions that we make about technology we think will be impacting tens of millions of lives 10 years from now. And so it's that context we bring this. We're spending today about $1.5 billion on R&D. So again, it's not the biggest effort in the world, but I think a substantial effort in turn to try to use technology to not only make patients feel better, but actually to have some impact on the cost of care. I thought I'd just again interject again, as the world's largest medical device company, we actually don't participate in what is probably the most important medical device invention of all time, founded here in the UK in the 30s and 40s. This is the total hip replacement. Again, it's just an example of innovation at work in the UK. You also get credit for another one of the most ubiquitous devices in the world, which is the intraocular lens. I think most of you probably are aware that this actually came out of the Battle of Britain. And as the Royal Air Force pilots were being shot down during the Battle of Britain, the windshields of the aircraft actually were made of plexiglass or perspex, and Sir Harold Ridley, an ophthalmologist working with the RAF, recognized as he took care of these pilots that they actually tolerated these foreign bodies in their eyes without rejection, and he had the innovative leap that maybe we could use plexiglass or perspex to actually form lenses. And so the most common device used in the world is actually an intraocular lens. And again, it's just another example of innovation at work here in the UK. So the point of my talk today is how are we going to use technology to not only make people better, extend life, restore health, but how are we going to actually use this to take cost out of the system? And again, in really symphony with the theme of this exposition is through innovation. Innovation is a pretty hackneyed term. It's been a bit overused. There's many ways to innovate in healthcare. And I've just listed here a few examples. You can innovate in delivery. NHS perhaps is the best example of that. You can innovate in how you reimburse with it. And so NICE is actually a good example here in the UK of how you can look at issues of comparative effectiveness and decide whether to pay and reimburse. There's no question, I think, that your institution of NICE is probably one of the most innovative healthcare programs in the world. And as we go through our change in healthcare in the United States, I think there's no question that much of what Obama wants to do is actually going to mimic what is being done in the innovative reimbursement schemes really set out here in the UK. There are all sorts of interesting ways to innovate in distribution and manufacturing. I'm not going to talk about that today. I'd like to focus really just on how we're going to use technology to innovate. And as I mentioned, I'm going to sort of go through some themes for the decade and how this actually drives our strategy. And so the first issue, and I think it's clear, is that the biggest threat to healthcare systems around the world is the onset of aging patients who necessarily have chronic degenerative diseases. Now, some of you may be religious, and I don't want you to take this the wrong way, but I'm pretty certain that there is no such thing as intelligent design. That our bodies were not designed to last to be 80, 90 years of age, and so things fall apart. Spines degenerate, the vascular system degenerates, neurological degeneration is going to be one of the greatest issues of healthcare systems around the world and here in the UK in the next 20 years. And so the question is how do we prepare for this aging population with degenerative diseases where, as you will see, consume the bulk of healthcare dollars. And there's no question that somehow we have to figure out how do we take care of these people and at the same time reducing the cost, because otherwise the US is clearly on a trajectory to bankruptcy in our healthcare system, and I would argue that most countries are as well. One of the biggest issues as we sort of plan for this decade is that we not only can't bring out technology that actually looks like it works, seems to be a nice idea, we have to somehow be able to prove that this is more effective than what's available. And so one of the greatest challenges we have as a medical device company is how do we not only bring products out, but how do we create the evidence in clinical trials to really sustain reimbursement and actually encourage adoption of these things. I've spent a lot of time operating in hospitals in the United Kingdom over the last 30 years, and we were just talking about tort litigation out here in the hallway with the U.S. Embassy, and there's not as much litigation here in England as there is in the U.S., and one of the reasons for that is that patients have relied on the wisdom of their doctors, I think, much more in the UK than in the US. This falls beneath the rubric of clinical judgment, and I'm here to argue today that comparative effectiveness, the kinds of clinical studies that NICE has required, is going to ultimately trump clinical judgment, and that physicians are not simply going to do what they want to do and have patients acquiesce to that. And so as we plan our strategies for the decade, you have to realize that clinical trials are going to be crucial to everything we do. These in themselves are expensive, but ultimately take cost out of the system by proving yes or no that these therapies are better than existing therapies. I don't think I need to remind people in this room that there's going to be a doubling of the population of people over 60 in the G8 countries in the next 30 years. And the implications for this are absolutely massive. Let me put this in another way. By 2050, there will be over 2 billion people in the world over the age of 60, and I'm pretty certain that the world hadn't planned for this.